An employee steals from his boss, but gets caught in a trap set by karma. Ethan Cole, a 32-year-old man with sharp gray eyes and a disarming smile, had always been seen as the ideal employee. He dressed neatly in navy suits, polished shoes, and carried himself with quiet confidence. His boss, Harold Grant, a man in his 50s with silver hair and calm authority, trusted Ethan more than anyone else. Harold believed Ethan was loyal, dependable, and committed to the company's growth. But beneath that professional charm, Ethan harbored resentment. He watched Harold's wealth, his lifestyle, his control over the company, and envy began to poison his heart. What started as admiration turned into bitterness. Why should Harold have everything while Ethan remained in the shadows, scraping for promotions that never came? The thought of taking what wasn't his first appeared as a whisper in the back of his mind. He pushed it away, but temptation has a way of returning stronger each time. Soon, Ethan began to imagine a future where he had more than just a salary, where Harold's success could become his stepping stone. Little did he know the seeds of betrayal he was planting would grow into a trap he could never escape. Every evening when the office grew quiet, Ethan lingered behind under the pretense of finishing reports. In truth, he prowled through files, memorizing codes, studying transaction details, and identifying loopholes in the system. His ambition was no longer to rise through dedication, it was to steal. Harold's company dealt with high-value contracts, funds moving in and out daily. To Ethan, it felt like an untapped treasure chest waiting for a clever mind to unlock. He told himself it wasn't really stealing, it was simply taking what he deserved after years of hard work. Greed grew inside him like a wildfire. He began to live in two worlds, the polished, polite employee everyone respected by day, and the scheming thief plotting Harold's downfall by night. He convinced himself he was too intelligent to be caught. After all, who would suspect the most loyal employee? But Ethan's arrogance blinded him to a greater truth. When betrayal brews in secret, the universe has its own way of preparing justice. What he thought was opportunity was, in fact, a trap tightening around him, one mistake away from snapping shut. Ethan refined his act so carefully that not even Harold's sharp instincts detected danger. He volunteered for extra work, offered advice during meetings, and even brought coffee for his boss. His colleagues admired him, calling him the backbone of the office. The more praise he received, the deeper his deception became. Harold, however, was not entirely naive. Though he valued Ethan, he had spent decades building his empire, and he knew human nature well enough to recognize the hunger in Ethan's eyes. Greed leaves traces, small but undeniable. Harold noticed how Ethan lingered near the accounts department, how he was always the last to leave the office, how his questions sometimes strayed too close to financial details. Instead of confronting him, Harold remained silent. He began to design a quiet test, a hidden trap that would reveal Ethan's true character. But Harold was not cruel. He wanted proof before judgment. Meanwhile, Ethan, drunk on his own cleverness, believed he was untouchable. The game of appearances was now set. Ethan thought he was manipulating Harold, but in truth, Harold was already preparing the stage where betrayal would meet justice. The opportunity came sooner than Ethan expected. One evening, he discovered a series of dormant accounts, funds lying untouched, waiting to be shifted. His pulse quickened. This was it. He could siphon the money discreetly, leaving no trace, and no one would notice for months. He rehearsed the plan in his head like a chess player mapping each move. The accounts would be rerouted into a shadow company under a false name, and the trail would vanish behind layers of forged transactions. Ethan spent sleepless nights perfecting his scheme, convinced he was a mastermind destined for greatness. But Harold had already anticipated such a move. Quietly, he had placed a digital marker within those very accounts, a silent alarm disguised as routine code. To Ethan, it looked like ordinary numbers. To Harold, it was a glowing sign that would expose treachery the moment someone touched it. Ethan executed his first transfer late at night, heart pounding, convinced his future had finally shifted. He didn't realize that with every keystroke, he was stepping directly into Harold's silent trap, a trap designed not just to catch a thief but to expose him completely. When the funds shifted successfully, Ethan felt an intoxicating rush of power. He looked at the numbers on his screen, real money, his for the taking. He smiled, his sharp gray eyes glinting with greed. To him it was proof that he was smarter than Harold, smarter than the system, smarter than fate itself. The next morning, Ethan arrived at work with a newfound swagger. His navy suit felt sharper, his stride more confident. He watched Harold seated calmly in his office and felt a surge of superiority. If only you knew, Ethan thought, the empire you built now belongs to me. But arrogance is the loudest whisper to karma. Though Ethan believed he had secured victory, the truth was far more sinister. Harold had already seen the red flags. Silent reports were landing on his desk, showing every move Ethan thought he had hidden. Ethan's first taste of victory was not the beginning of success, but the first step into a carefully laid snare, and as he savored his illusion of triumph, destiny was already sharpening its claws for the moment of reckoning. After his first success, Ethan grew bolder. One stolen transfer wasn't enough. Greed, once fed, demands more. He began taking larger risks, rerouting greater sums into his shadow accounts. Each time he felt invincible, untouchable, as though fortune itself had chosen him to rise above his boss. He started imagining a new life, luxury cars, lavish homes, expensive suits far beyond his current Navy business attire. At 32, he believed he was finally breaking free from the chains of mediocrity. What Harold built over decades, Ethan would claim in months. But every move Ethan made was logged by Harold's hidden system. The trap wasn't just about catching Ethan red-handed. It was about allowing him to dig the hole deeper. The more Ethan stole, the more damning the evidence became. Ethan couldn't see the net tightening around him. He was too blinded by ambition. To his colleagues, he remained the same polished man with sharp gray eyes and a winning smile. But to fate, he was a thief sprinting toward his own downfall. The quiet hum of the office no longer sounded like routine. It was the whisper of karma waiting for the right moment to strike. Harold Grant, seasoned and wise, reviewed the silent reports on his computer with a heavy heart. Each transaction Ethan had manipulated was highlighted, each deception carefully traced. Harold's silver brows furrowed, not in anger but in disappointment. He had trusted Ethan like a son. Still, Harold wasn't surprised. Decades in business had taught him that envy was a more dangerous poison than incompetence, and Ethan's ambition had always carried a sharp edge. Harold realized it wasn't enough to know the truth. He needed to let Ethan believe he was still winning, so the trap would close with undeniable force. Harold played his role flawlessly. He greeted Ethan with kindness, asked for his advice during meetings, and continued praising his dedication. The more Harold smiled, the more Ethan believed he was safe. But behind Harold's calm demeanor, he was orchestrating a final test, a decisive snare from which Ethan could never escape. Harold didn't want revenge, he wanted justice, and justice, he knew, is far more powerful when it comes silently, when the betrayer never sees it until the final second. Ethan's betrayal had shifted from suspicion to fact. Now all Harold had to do was wait for the perfect moment. Ethan's double life began to strain. Though he still dressed sharply in his navy suits and polished shoes, he carried an arrogance that made his colleagues uneasy. His once friendly smile now seemed forced, and his gray eyes gleamed with something darker. Greed mixed with paranoia. At night he barely slept. He checked his shadow accounts repeatedly, convincing himself the money was safe. But anxiety gnawed at him. What if someone noticed? What if Harold discovered the missing funds? He told himself he was too clever. But even clever minds stumble when weighed down by guilt. During one meeting, Harold asked a simple question about company expenses. Ethan's hands trembled as he replied, though he forced a confident smile. Harold nodded calmly, but Ethan's heart pounded. For the first time, he wondered if his boss suspected something. The cracks in his mask grew wider. His colleagues whispered about his sudden mood swings, his distracted gaze, his nervous habits. Still, Ethan ignored the warnings. He believed the finish line was near, and once he secured enough wealth, he would vanish into a new life. But what Ethan failed to realize was that Harold had already mapped out his exit straight into a trap of his own making. One late evening, Ethan discovered what seemed like the ultimate prize, an account containing more funds than all his previous thefts combined. His pulse raced as he stared at the numbers on the screen. This wasn't just money, it was escape. With this, he could disappear forever, leaving behind Harold, the company, and any trace of suspicion. The temptation was overwhelming. He paced the empty office, torn between caution and greed. His instincts whispered that it was too perfect, too easy. But greed shouted louder, drowning out every warning. He convinced himself that fortune favored the bold, and this was the moment he had been waiting for. He began the transfer, fingers trembling as he typed. Every keystroke echoed in the silence, sounding louder than thunder in his ears. When the confirmation appeared, Ethan leaned back in his chair, a smug grin stretching across his face. He believed he had outplayed everyone, but in truth, Harold had designed this account specifically for him. It wasn't just bait, it was the lock on the cage. Ethan had taken the final step willingly, sealing his own fate without even realizing it. The next morning, Ethan walked into the office with an air of triumph. His navy suit seemed brighter, his polished shoes louder against the floor, his smile wider than ever. He greeted colleagues with exaggerated charm, convinced he was now untouchable. Harold watched him quietly from his office window. To everyone else, it was just another day, but Harold knew it was the beginning of the end. The evidence was complete. The trap had sprung. All that remained was timing, the perfect moment to confront betrayal head-on. Ethan's confidence blinded him to the subtle changes around him. The finance department worked quietly, whispering behind closed doors. Harold's secretary avoided his gaze. Even the atmosphere of the office seemed heavier, though Ethan brushed it off as paranoia. By noon, Harold had scheduled a private meeting with Ethan. "We need to discuss something important," Harold said calmly, his voice steady. Ethan nodded, feigning confidence, though his stomach tightened with unease. For the first time, a flicker of fear passed through Ethan's gray eyes. He didn't know it yet, but the storm he thought he had outrun was already upon him, and karma was waiting in the room ahead. Ethan entered Harold's office with his usual polished appearance, navy suit pressed, gray eyes sharp, and a forced confidence in his stride. Harold sat behind his mahogany desk, his expression calm, almost too calm. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting shadows across the room, and for the first time Ethan felt as though he had stepped into a courtroom rather than a conversation. "Close the door, Ethan," Harold said gently. Ethan obeyed, though his palms were beginning to sweat. Harold's voice was steady, almost fatherly. "You've been with me for many years. I've trusted you with responsibilities most people could only dream of. Do you think that trust has been well placed?" Ethan forced a smile. "Of course, sir. I've always done my best for the company." Harold leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "Interesting answer." He slid a folder across the desk. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were transaction reports, each one showing the very transfers he thought were invisible. The room grew silent. Ethan's gray eyes widened, his mask cracking at last. Harold had not accused him with words. He had let the evidence speak. For the first time, Ethan realized he wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. Ethan stared at the documents, his face draining of color. Every detail of his theft was laid out in black and white, undeniable and complete. The room felt smaller, suffocating. As Harold's calm gaze weighed on him heavier than any words could, "Do you have anything to say?" Harold asked finally. His voice wasn't angry, it was disappointed, like a father addressing a disobedient son. That tone cut deeper than rage ever could. Ethan scrambled for excuses. This must be a mistake. Maybe the system." "Don't insult me, Ethan," Harold interrupted firmly, though his voice never rose. "I gave you a chance to prove loyalty, and you chose betrayal. You thought you were clever, but every step you took, I was watching." Ethan's gray eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape. The once sharp lines of his navy suit now felt like shackles. He opened his mouth, but no excuse could erase the undeniable truth on the papers before him. For years, Ethan believed he was outsmarting his boss. But in this moment, staring at the overwhelming evidence, he realized he had only been outsmarting himself. Panic surged through Ethan's veins. His polished composure shattered as he dropped the papers onto the desk. "Please, Harold, listen. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You only wanted what wasn't yours." Harold cut in, his silver brows knitting together. "You had opportunities to earn, to rise, to succeed honestly. Instead, you chose theft, and now you beg for forgiveness, not out of guilt, but out of fear." Ethan's voice cracked. "I can fix this. I'll return everything. Just give me another chance." But Harold remained unmoved. "Trust, Ethan, is like glass. Once broken, it can never be whole again. You didn't just steal money, you stole faith, loyalty, and respect. And those are things no amount of repayment can buy back." Ethan fell to his knees, his sharp gray eyes now clouded with desperation. The man who once believed he was invincible now looked like a child cornered by his own mistakes. But karma is merciless, and Harold knew mercy in this case would only enable further corruption. The plea had been made, the verdict was yet to come. Harold pressed a button on his desk phone. Moments later, 2 members of the finance department entered, followed by a security officer. Ethan's gray eyes widened in terror. His carefully constructed mask of loyalty had been stripped away, and now everyone would see him for what he truly was, a thief. "This man has been betraying this company," Harold said firmly, his voice steady and resolute. "The evidence is all here. Take him into custody until the authorities arrive." Ethan scrambled to his feet, his navy suit wrinkled, his once proud posture collapsed. "No, please, Harold, don't do this, don't ruin me." But Harold didn't respond. He only watched silently as Ethan was restrained. The employees who once admired Ethan now looked at him with disgust and pity. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the company like wildfire. Ethan's carefully built reputation crumbled in an instant. He had thought himself untouchable, but now, stripped of dignity, he realized the truth. Betrayal always unmasks itself. For Harold, it wasn't victory. It was a tragedy, the loss of a man he once trusted. But for Ethan, it was the beginning of a downfall he could never escape. Ethan was escorted out of the building, his head hung low, his gray eyes filled with shame. The once respected employee, dressed in a navy suit that now looked like a costume of deceit, was paraded past his colleagues. Each stare, each whisper was a dagger to his pride. Outside, the police were waiting. The click of the handcuffs echoed like a final judgment, binding him not just physically but morally. The dream of wealth, power, and freedom evaporated into the cold air, leaving only regret and fear behind. As he was pushed into the back of the police car, Ethan glanced at the office windows. He could see Harold standing there, calm and composed, watching the consequences unfold. Ethan's heart twisted with bitterness. He had lost everything. Not only the stolen wealth, but his career, his reputation, and the trust of those who once admired him. For Ethan, this was not just the loss of freedom. It was the loss of identity. The disloyal employee had been exposed, and there was no mask left to hide behind. The fall was complete, but karma wasn't finished yet. The punishment was only beginning. Weeks later, Ethan found himself in court, seated in the defendant's chair. His navy suit was gone, replaced with a plain prison uniform. His once sharp gray eyes were now hollow, haunted by sleepless nights and the weight of disgrace. The evidence was overwhelming. Transaction reports, digital trails, testimonies from colleagues, all painting a picture of calculated betrayal. Ethan's lawyer attempted to argue for leniency, claiming he was under financial stress, but the jury saw through the lies. Harold attended the trial, sitting quietly at the back. He didn't look at Ethan with hatred, only with the disappointment of a man who had seen potential wasted by greed. That look stung Ethan more than the judge's words. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, Ethan's world shattered completely. The sentence was years in prison, years to reflect on the choices that led him there. The trial wasn't just about law, it was about truth, and the truth was undeniable. Ethan had betrayed the very hand that lifted him, and now he would pay the ultimate price. Prison was nothing like Ethan's fantasies of wealth and power. Gone were the polished shoes and tailored suits. Gone was the respect of colleagues. Here he was just another inmate, stripped of identity, reduced to a number. The gray eyes that once gleamed with arrogance now stared blankly at concrete walls. The nights were long, filled with regret, replaying every decision that had led him here. He remembered Harold's calm voice, the disappointment in his tone, and it haunted him more than the prison bars. Ethan tried to convince himself he could endure it, that one day he would rebuild, but the whispers of betrayal followed him even here. Inmates mocked him for his fall from grace, guards sneered at the white-collar thief, and the silence of the night screamed louder than his guilt. For a man who had once believed he was too clever to be caught, prison was the harshest teacher. It stripped him of illusions and forced him to face the reality of his betrayal. Karma wasn't just punishment, it was transformation through suffering. But for Ethan, it was far too late to undo the damage. Back at the company, Harold stood in his office staring out at the city skyline. The empire he built still thrived, but the betrayal of Ethan weighed heavily on him. He thought of the sharp-eyed young man he had once trusted, the employee he had treated like family. Harold didn't celebrate Ethan's downfall. There was no joy in watching someone destroy themselves. Instead, he reflected on the fragility of trust and the dangers of envy. He resolved to be even more cautious in the future, but he also knew that betrayal was an unavoidable risk in leadership. For Harold, justice had been served. The company was safe, the thief exposed, and the future secure. Yet a part of him mourned, not for the stolen money, but for the wasted potential of a man who could have achieved greatness through honesty. He whispered to himself, "Greed blinds the heart and betrayal destroys the soul." Harold turned back to his desk, ready to continue building his legacy, knowing that the shadow of betrayal would always linger as a reminder. Ethan's story spread beyond the company. It became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, taught in training sessions, and remembered by every employee. The disloyal worker who thought he could outsmart his boss had ended up outsmarted by karma instead. The lesson was clear. Betrayal always carries a price, and greed never leads to true success. Those who heard the story understood that shortcuts to wealth only lead to ruin, while loyalty and integrity build legacies that last. Ethan, locked away, became the example of what happens when ambition turns to corruption. Harold, still standing tall, became the example of wisdom and vigilance. The tale of Ethan Cole was not just about theft. It was about the dangers of envy, the fragility of trust, and the inevitability of justice. and for those who listened closely, it was a warning never to let greed consume the soul. Years later, Ethan looked into the small mirror in his prison cell. His once sharp gray eyes were dulled, his youthful face worn with regret. The navy suits, the polished shoes, the arrogant smile, all were memories of a man who thought he could cheat destiny. He finally understood the truth. He hadn't lost to Harold or to the system. He had lost to himself. His betrayal had been his own undoing, his greed the very trap that destroyed him. Outside the prison walls, Harold continued his life, respected and admired. Inside, Ethan carried the weight of his choices, each day a reminder of the moment he let greed replace loyalty. The story ended not with riches or triumph, but with a shattered man realizing too late that karma had been watching all along. And so, the tale of the disloyal employee serves as a warning to all who dare walk the same path. Betrayal may seem like a shortcut, but it always leads to ruin. If you enjoyed this story of suspense, betrayal, and karma's justice, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales of greed, deception, and downfall.